Here's the question that's been ricocheting across European social media ever since the World Cup 2026 announcement. How in the world did America manage to become the place where hardened, cynical Europeans actually feel welcome?
I feel like the American confidence gets a lot of criticism, but it's something that I've really appreciated as a foreigner. We were literally just walking Venice Beach and Joe sneezes and some guy comes up and he's like, "Oh, bless you." And then as we're walking along the beach, this lady comes up to me and she approaches me in such a familiar, friendly way that I genuinely thought she was talking to someone else. And she said "Oh my God, I love your shirt." And
The stereotype was always supposed to be the opposite. America was supposed to be loud, gun-obsessed, culturally illiterate, with crumbling infrastructure and a healthcare system that bankrupted families. But something happened over the past few years that completely undermined every single one of those preconceived notions. And if you stick with me, I'll walk you through exactly what it was.
Hello, Alana.
Good.
What do you think about it?
Awesome. It just changed my mind into it's all good.
It changed my mind into all good as well.
And I can't believe how good it is. I can't stop saying it's good. It's good, it's good, it's good. Please give us a like if you liked.
If you find yourself curious about what actually happened when Europeans finally saw America for what it truly is, not the political caricature, but the lived reality, you're going to want to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this is the conversation we're having right now. Let's start with something almost embarrassing for European pride: hospitality. Now, I'm not talking about the scripted, performative kind you get at a five-star hotel in Paris. I'm talking about the kind where a total stranger, someone who has nothing to gain and doesn't know your name, simply decides that your day matters enough to interrupt their own. A British couple visiting Florida for the first time decided to stop at a random diner off the highway. They were tired, overwhelmed, a little bit jet-lagged, and honestly skeptical that this would be anything other than a commercialized, soulless transaction.
I cannot put into words how much I have fallen in love with Key West. This place is honestly like a dream. It's like I'm living in a dream right now. It's so tropical, so beautiful. But this place is a dream come true. There's iguanas, there's roosters, there's jacked up golf buggies everywhere, there's mopeds. It's insane. This place is...
The server not only refilled their water glass 17 times without asking, but when she noticed they were looking at the menu in that bewildered way people do when they can't decide, she sat down in the booth next to them and spent 15 minutes actually talking them through every option. That doesn't happen in London. A Swedish tourist who went to a college football game in Austin reported something similar. She sat next to a group of locals who realized she was from out of the country, and by halftime, they'd invited her to a post-game barbecue at someone's house. No ulterior motive, no expectation of anything in return. Just the assumption that a visitor to their town deserved to see what their town was actually like, not just the stadium. And it's not just isolated incidents. A German couple who drove through the American South documented their experience online. And what struck them wasn't any single moment, but the accumulation of dozens of small, genuine interactions. A gas station attendant who helped them figure out their rental car's fuel cap. A police officer who, instead of being stern, actually joked with them about their accent and gave them directions without making it feel like a transaction. A small-town shopkeeper in Tennessee who, when she learned they were visiting from Stuttgart, started asking about Germany with genuine curiosity, not the kind where you're performing interest, but the kind where you actually care about the answer. For Europeans raised in social systems that value privacy and personal space almost above all else, this level of unsolicited warmth registers as something between exotic and mildly invasive, but almost universally, when they're asked about it afterward, they say the same thing. It made them feel genuinely valued.
American people are so much friendlier than Brits. I've noticed from the first day or so of being here. I don't know how or why, but just how they approach you, they're just so much more positive. And I feel like that also is how they look at wealth and success.
Here's the uncomfortable truth that European travelers keep admitting, usually quietly, often with a little laugh, often with a sense of guilt. This isn't how they expected to feel. They came armed with criticisms. They came ready to document the evidence of American decline. Instead, they found themselves in situations where they were the outsiders being brought into someone else's community, someone else's family, sometimes even someone else's home. Not because they'd earned it, but simply because they'd shown up. A Danish woman who attended a Thanksgiving celebration in Boston.
I could cry because I've just found the thing that I miss the most when I go back home to the UK. Oh my god, I'm gonna cry! I found a Sonic! Oh, a crushed ice! I can confirm I have acquired crushed ice. Okay, I have waited months and months.
Hosted by a family she'd met through an online travel forum, just 3 weeks prior later, said that she'd spent her entire life being told that Americans were shallow and materialistic. And then, she watched 4 generations of a family she didn't know fight over dishes because everyone wanted to cook something special just to make sure she had options. Didn't want her to feel like an outsider on what is basically the most family-centric holiday Americans have. This hospitality, when you actually sit with it, is rooted in something deeper than mere manners. It's rooted in a kind of fundamental assumption that Americans make, often without realizing it, that their country is worth knowing, that their experiences are worth sharing, and that bringing someone into your world, whether it's a diner, a football game, or your family's Thanksgiving, is an ordinary thing to do.
Genuinely confuses me about America. It's not the food, it's not the size, it's not the trucks. It's the fact that strangers are so genuinely kind. Anywhere you walk, hello, how you doing, giving you a bit of advice about what trail to go down. Stay away from that moose, they're really aggressive.
Europeans, by contrast, are often operating from a different assumption, that your private life is your business, that friendliness doesn't require intimate connection, and that being polite is actually about maintaining a certain amount of distance. When an American asks, "How are you?" at a checkout counter, they sometimes actually want to know. When a European asks it, it's often just a verbal formality that doesn't require a real answer. Neither approach is wrong, but they're deeply different. And for European visitors who'd internalized the idea that America was some kind of dystopia hiding under a thin veneer of consumption, the experience of being genuinely welcomed over and over, in city after city, created a kind of cognitive dissonance that they couldn't quite explain away. Now let's talk about something that sounds shallow, but is actually profoundly revealing. Scale. Drive across the American West for 10 hours and you're still in the same state. Try explaining that to someone who grew up in a country where 10 hours of driving can take you through 4 different nations, each with a different language, different currency, different history. A Dutch family spent a week exploring Arizona and Nevada, and the experience genuinely disoriented them. They were used to efficiency, density, careful organization of space. America's relationship to space is almost the opposite. It's lavish, almost careless, definitely abundant. The concept of the American gas station had them particularly confused. They'd gone to Bucky E's, which is functionally a small city pretending to be a gas station, and a Swedish tourist who experienced it for the first time described it as a Disneyland themed after bathroom breaks in beef jerky. But it's more than just the novelty. It's that the scale of infrastructure, the highways that seem to go on forever, the supermarkets that stock 40 different varieties of peanut butter, the pickup trucks that look like they could transport a house, all of it sends a message. The message is, we have so much space, so many resources, so much abundance, that we can afford to think big, to spread out, to make everything slightly larger than necessary. And when you've grown up in a country where efficiency is a moral value, where space is rationed and resources are limited, that abundance reads as something more than just convenience. It reads as confidence.
Train is a beast. Look at the size of that thing and how far they go. I swear some of them are like miles and miles long. That makes me happy. It's the small things in life, you know? Whoa, step back. Wow.
A French woman who spent a month road tripping from California to Colorado documented her reactions on social media, and what she kept coming back to was this idea that American scale creates a kind of psychological freedom. You drive on a highway where there are 6 lanes in each direction, and it changes how you think about movement, about possibility. You go to a supermarket in rural Montana and realize that the store is bigger than her entire hometown shopping district, and it says something about what a society believes is possible. You stay in a hotel room that's inexplicably large just for one person, and you start to understand that Americans have built their entire infrastructure around the assumption of abundance. For a continent that spent the 20th century dealing with scarcity, real scarcity, rationing scarcity, war scarcity, the American relationship to space and resources is almost unsettling. It's not that Europeans think it's wasteful, necessarily. It's that they recognize it as a reflection of a different historical experience, a different set of assumptions about what's possible. The geography itself becomes a kind of character study. A British hiking group spent 2 weeks exploring Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, and they kept saying the same thing. These places don't exist in Europe, not at this scale, not with this kind of geological drama. You can drive for 8 hours across Wyoming, and the landscape barely changes. Endless high plains, dramatic sky, a kind of emptiness that's almost meditative. For Europeans, whose relationship to nature is usually mediated through carefully managed national parks or hiking trails that follow established routes, the American wilderness, especially in the interior West, is overwhelming. There's nothing to contain it. You're not visiting nature, you're passing through it. A Swedish woman who hiked into the backcountry in Utah said it was the first time she'd experienced complete silence. No distant traffic sounds, no reminder of human civilization, just the landscape and the vastness of it. That produces a kind of humility that she said she'd never experienced in Europe, even in places that were theoretically designed to give you that feeling. Here's a question for you. If you grew up in a densely packed continent where you can drive across an entire nation in less than a day, how do you process a place where the distances are so vast that time itself starts to feel different? It changes you. It changes how you think about human scale, about what's important, about what matters. Then there's the question of safety, which is where American perceptions get really interesting. The stereotype in Europe is that America is a dangerous, chaotic place where mass violence is a constant background threat. And to be fair, the statistics around gun violence in America are objectively worse than in most Western European countries.
That is unbelievable. Unbelievable. That just melts like butter in your mouth. I'm just praying I haven't bitten off more than I can chew. Literally. Look at the size of that. Mental. Lots of people giving out about the hydration breaks in the World Cup, but Jesus, I need one now.
That's not debatable. But here's what's strange. The actual lived experience of being in America, especially in the cities and towns where tourists spend time, is often profoundly different from what Europeans expect. A group of German tourists who spent time in several American cities documented their experience. And what they noticed first wasn't danger, it was order. Cities looked clean, streets were well lit. Police presence, when they encountered it, was professional and even occasionally friendly. The college town where one of them stayed felt safer than parts of Berlin, and she said that out loud, feeling a little bit guilty, like she'd betrayed some European consensus about how dangerous America is. The reality is more complicated. Obviously, America is a huge country, and safety varies dramatically by neighborhood and city. But the tourist experience in carefully chosen destinations is often one of comfort and security, not danger. A French couple who visited Miami said they'd expected to be constantly on guard, but instead found themselves relaxing into the rhythm of the city, enjoying the weather and the energy without the constant background anxiety they'd anticipated.
It's very sweet. It tastes like a dessert mixed with like German horse semen. I love it. This is cornbread. Americans find a way to put corn in everything. They put corn in the cream, they put corn in bread, and in the vaccines also. Corn's everywhere.
What European tourists are often stumbling into is the realization that the parts of America that tourists actually visit, the cities that have invested in tourism infrastructure, the neighborhoods that are designed to be welcoming, the public spaces that have been actively maintained, are often genuinely pleasant and safe. The problems that make headlines, the gun violence, the inequality, the dysfunction, those things are real, but they're often geographically concentrated in ways that the European perception doesn't quite capture. When a Spanish tourist spends a week in Denver or Austin or San Diego, they're seeing America through a lens of sunshine and hospitality and ordered public space. The version of America you see from a tourist hotel is different from the version you see from certain neighborhoods at midnight, from the emergency room of an overwhelmed public hospital, from a news broadcast about the latest shooting. But that's not unique to America. Every country has its tourist version and its reality version. The difference is that America's tourist version is particularly good at selling itself as the real thing. Now let's talk about money, because this is where things get genuinely unsettling for many European visitors. The average wage in America, even at entry level, is higher than in most European countries. A young British man who took a summer job at a hotel in Miami was shocked to discover that his hourly wage was nearly double what entry-level workers were making in London. He was doing the exact same job, but in a country where living costs are ostensibly higher. A German IT worker who was offered a remote contract job based in an American company found that the salary was 3 times what he would have been paid for the same work in Berlin. This isn't universal, and there are plenty of nuances here. Healthcare costs in America eat into that wage in ways that they don't in Europe. The tax structure is different. The social safety net is thinner.
Apollo sausage. So let's give this a go. Also got mac and cheese and collard greens. Collard greens. So, collard greens first. Yeah. Mac and cheese. Oh my gosh. It made me whisper. This is really good mac and cheese. This might be one of the best I've had since I've been here. First, rib. Let's go. Yo. Now I see what you're telling me.
But the raw numbers are striking. A Swedish economist traveling through the country noted that Americans seem to operate from a different assumption about what labor is worth, what productivity should be compensated at, what an acceptable standard of living actually costs. Housing was cheaper in many places than she'd expected. A used car that would have cost 30,000 euros in Sweden could be purchased for $8,000 here. Food prices at supermarkets were lower. Labor was more valued. It created this strange sensation for European visitors, the realization that they might actually be able to live better, earn more, and have less financial anxiety in a country that they'd been taught was economically chaotic and destabilized. A couple from France who spent time looking into the possibility of relocating described this moment as almost disorienting. They'd done everything right according to the European model. They had solid education, professional jobs, savings, but they also felt the constant background anxiety of European life, concern about pension sufficiency, anxiety about healthcare access, the constant calculation of whether they could afford children. When they looked at the American job market, at the wages on offer, at the cost of living, they had to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that they might actually have more economic freedom and possibility in a country they'd been trained to see as fundamentally broken. This wasn't true for everyone. Certain European countries, certain professions, certain life circumstances can be perfectly comfortable. But for a meaningful segment of educated European workers, America represents an economic opportunity that's genuinely different from what Europe offers. And that realization, when it hits, is destabilizing. It requires you to interrogate assumptions you've held your entire adult life. But here's where this gets psychologically interesting. The American economic system, especially as experienced by tourists and short-term visitors, feels less anxious because it works on optimism. An American entrepreneur or worker operates with a kind of fundamental belief that effort will be rewarded, that risk-taking will be compensated, that if you work hard enough, you can build something. There's no guarantee of success, and plenty of people fail. But the cultural assumption is that failure is not permanent, that you can try again, that the deck isn't fundamentally stacked against you. That's a different psychological context than much of Europe operates within, where the system is designed to protect you from failure, but also makes it harder to exceed expectations. An English woman who started a small business in Austin said that she was shocked by how supportive Americans were of her as an entrepreneur. People wanted to help. They believed in the possibility of it working. In London, or in most European cities, people seemed more skeptical, more cautious, more invested in pointing out what could go wrong. The American version felt riskier, but also more energizing. Now we get to something that makes European visitors genuinely uncomfortable: patriotism and national identity. In Europe, patriotism is treated with caution, almost suspicion. especially after the 20th century. Nationalism caused wars. Patriotism enabled fascism. The European approach is to be post-national, to emphasize European identity over individual national identity, to treat love of country as something vaguely embarrassing or even dangerous. And then, you go to America and you see flags everywhere. You see them on houses, on business fronts, on bumpers, in public spaces. You go to a high school football game and you see the national anthem performed with actual reverence and emotion. You visit a small town and you see this sense of pride in place, in community, in country. That's almost unnerving to Europeans who've been taught that this kind of feeling is precisely what you need to inoculate yourself against. A Swedish woman who attended a July 4th celebration in a small Colorado town said the experience was like stepping into another world. There was genuine festivity, genuine patriotism, genuine belief that being American meant something, was something to celebrate. And the weird part was that it wasn't jingoistic or aggressive. It was joyful. There was no sense that America was better than other countries, just a straightforward celebration of belonging to something. In Europe, she said that level of flag waving would be immediately suspect, would be read as potentially fascistic. But here it just felt like community pride. A Dutch tourist who went to a Rangers game in New York was struck by the National Guard men and women in uniform being recognized during the game, receiving genuine applause, not as a political statement, but as a recognition of service. The emotional register was completely different from what he'd expected. An Irish woman who spent time in the South described locals' patriotism as almost religious in its intensity. But again, without the aggression or the sense of superiority. It was love of home, expressed unself-consciously, which is something she realized she'd almost never witnessed in Europe, where patriotism has to justify itself, has to be defensive, has to prove it's not fascism. What's happening in these moments is that Europeans are encountering a form of national identity that isn't based on contrast with or superiority to other nations. It's based on a kind of fundamental sense of belonging, of connection to place and community and shared story. America's story, for all its complications and contradictions, is a story about possibility and scale and freedom. And for tourists coming from countries where the story is often about limits and caution and historical trauma, that narrative, when you actually experience it in person, is intoxicating. It's not that America is objectively better. It's that it operates from a different emotional and psychological foundation, one that European visitors, for a moment, get to experience. Let's talk about food for a minute, because this is where the hospitality and the abundance and the cultural difference really crystallize. Americans eat bigger portions than Europeans. This isn't subtle. An Italian tourist who went to a diner in New Mexico ordered a hamburger and got a plate of food that would have constituted 2 or 3 meals at home. A Spanish woman who went to a Brazilian steakhouse in Dallas said the experience of having waiters continuously bring you different cuts of meat until you physically couldn't eat any more was somewhere between abundance and excess, and she wasn't quite sure which. But here's what's interesting. The price was often lower than she'd expect in a European restaurant, offering significantly smaller portions. The tipping culture also shocked Europeans. A standard 15 to 20% gratuity seemed outrageous to Germans used to leaving 5% or just rounding up the bill. But when you understand that American servers are paid below minimum wage and rely on tips for their income, the culture makes sense as a different system, one that ties service workers' income more directly to customer satisfaction. A French food critic who spent time analyzing American food culture noted that it represented a kind of different relationship to eating itself. In Europe, especially in France, food is about taste, about quality ingredients, about tradition, about the social ritual of eating together slowly. American food culture is often about convenience, scale, and satisfaction. The drive-through concept mystified a German woman until she realized it wasn't actually about laziness or lack of sophistication. It was about a different value system, one where time is treated as precious and convenience is treated as a form of respect for the customer. You're busy. We'll get you food quickly so you can do what you need to do. Regional food culture varies dramatically in America in ways that surprise European visitors accustomed to European cuisine being relatively consistent across borders. A Texas barbecue joint in Austin makes food completely different from a New Orleans po' boy shop, which is completely different from a Maine lobster shack, which is completely different from California farm-to-table restaurants. For a Dutch woman who traveled through multiple American regions, this food diversity suggested that America was, in some sense, multiple countries, each with its own culture and history and identity, stitched together into one larger political entity. That realization that America's unity comes despite its incredible internal diversity, not because of enforced homogeneity, was genuinely revelatory. Here's where we have to reckon with the turning point. Europeans arrived expecting to confirm their suspicions, and instead, they had to confront a reality that didn't fit the narrative. The infrastructure worked better than expected. The people were warmer than expected. The economic opportunities were more generous than expected. The public spaces were safer than expected. The natural beauty was more overwhelming than expected. The patriotism was less aggressive and more inclusive than expected. And so the question became, what do you do with that information? How do you integrate an experience that contradicts the framework through which you understood something? Most European visitors, when asked about their time in America, eventually find themselves saying something they didn't expect to say. They apologize, usually quietly, for having believed the narrative without checking it against reality. They admit that they'd been working from incomplete information, that they'd let political disagreements and cultural critiques substitute for actual lived experience. A German programmer who spent 3 months working remotely from an Austin co-working space said that he had to genuinely rebuild his understanding of what America was. He'd thought of it as a broken society held together by military spending and consumer debt. He left thinking of it as a complicated place, with genuine strengths and genuine problems, where the strengths were more obvious in person than they were from the European media or the critical intellectuals who shaped European opinion about America. This isn't an argument that Europe is bad or that America is good. It's an argument that both places are complex, that lived experience is different from abstraction, that visiting a country forces you to hold two ideas in your head simultaneously. Whatever structural problems exist, and whatever genuine human warmth and possibility you encounter. A Spanish woman who spent a summer in California working for a tech company returned to Madrid with a fundamentally different conception of what was possible, not just economically, but personally. She'd thought she understood America from films and news and conversation. She'd thought she was armed against its mythology. And then, she was standing on a beach in Santa Monica at sunset, having spent the day working with a team of people from 14 different countries, all of them energized and optimistic about what they were building. And she had to admit that she'd been wrong about something fundamental. The World Cup 2026 is coming to America, and what European fans will experience during those tournaments will matter. They'll get to interact with American hospitality on a mass scale. They'll see the infrastructure, the stadiums, the transportation, the hotels, the restaurants that Americans have built to host them. They'll encounter American patriotism expressed through sport, which is perhaps the least threatening form it can take. They'll spend money in American towns and cities and see their money welcomed. They'll eat American food and experience American abundance. And some of them will have the experience that previous European visitors have had. They'll arrive expecting one thing and experience another. They'll have to reckon with a gap between the narrative they arrived with and the reality they encountered. That reckoning, honestly, is valuable. It's uncomfortable, sure. It requires acknowledging that you believe something that turned out to be incomplete. But growth requires that discomfort. The question this raises for all of us is, how many of our certainties about other places, other cultures, other systems are actually based on lived experience versus absorbed criticism versus media narrative versus the opinions of people we respect? How many of them would survive actual encounter? And if we're building our understanding of the world on incomplete information, what's our responsibility to update it when we have access to better data? These questions matter because the gap between perception and reality shapes policy, shapes political rhetoric, shapes how nations relate to each other. When Europeans start genuinely understanding America, when Americans start genuinely understanding Europe, when people stop relying on caricature and start reckoning with complexity, that's when diplomatic relationships improve, when trade becomes easier, when cultural exchange actually becomes possible. So here's my final question for you. If you've been operating from a particular narrative about a place or a people or a system, when was the last time you actually tested that narrative against reality? Would you rather hold on to a comfortable belief that doesn't require you to do any work? Or would you rather go through the uncomfortable process of actually encountering something different from what you expected? If you're curious about how these encounters shape people, how travel changes perspective, how first experiences with new places rewrite the narratives we carry, if this conversation makes you want to see what else people are discovering about each other, hit like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Because we're in a moment where understanding each other across borders is more important than it's ever been, and that understanding has to start with actual encounter, actual experience, actual willingness to let reality complicate our narratives.